is the panel refashioning the web through art. Interesting panels of people, and in each case, for me, there's this question of quantifiable enjoyment and what does it mean when our desire is used by ourselves in ways we are unaware of or trying to be aware of. And first, we will start with a very interesting project by Benjamin Rosen. What do metrics want? Facebook, the metricator, and the easy of describe sociology. Sociology. Thank you.
So in Oliver Stone's Wall Street film sequel titled Money Never Sleeps, there's a scene where the young trader Jake Moore asks investment bank CEO Brendan James a question. He says, "What's your number? The amount of money it would take to be able to just walk away from it all and live happily ever after." You see, I find that everybody usually has a number and it's an exact number. So what is yours? The CEO pauses for effect and gives a one-word response: more. And in this scene, the mogul displays a fundamental trait of capitalist culture. He wants numbers to go higher. In this case, it's money. For many of us now, living so much of our lives on social networks, it's friends added, likes accrued, items shared, comments left. And as an artist, I focus on the cultural, social, and political implications of software. And so when I use software in my daily life, I'm also constantly analyzing it from this perspective. And with Facebook, I find myself continually focused on these numbers. How much do people like my status? How many friends do I have? Rather than focusing on who left something, or what they said, or who they are. And these quantifications, or what I refer to as metrics, are everywhere in the Facebook interface. And so this is a screenshot of my newsfeed from a few days ago, and I've circled all of the metric locations in red. These are the numbers that count likes, shares, comments, notifications, mutual friends, etc. My approach is to examine these metrics from a software studies perspective, looking for the ways these numbers are determining the conditions of possibility as Matthew Fuller would say. Before I talk about them specific, I want to go back and flesh out this desire for more. When we're faced with a number, why do we want that number to be larger? Why is more friends, more likes, more comments better than less? Now, I would argue that the answer lies in the relationship between our evolutionarily developed need for personal worth and the pervasiveness of capitalism. And if we consider, as Marx would say, that capital has resolved personal worth into exchange value, then for our purposes, I reverse that equation. Exchange value equivalent or resolved into personal worth. Personal worth is an essential human need. It falls on Maslow's hierarchy of esteem, it's self-relatedness, it's the need for self-connection, and it's a need that can only be fulfilled within a capitalist system. This is, as Mark Fisher has pointed out, we really can't imagine anything outside of capitalism anymore. And so one of the things that capital does is it creates a system of equivalence between cultural objects that promotes free trade as our sole freedom within the system. And so when these two are tied together, personal worth and capitalism, it stands to reason that we become subject to an inherent desire for more. A state of being where more exchange, more value, and more trade equals more personal worth. And so on Facebook, then, I would contend that all of these metrics are working to increase user engagement across the site, and sometimes producing near addictive patterns of behavior. And in the process, they start to prescribe certain kinds of social interactions. For example, when I'm constantly told how many friends I have and how many friends my friends have, I'm encouraged to keep adding more friends. In fact, the act of adding a friend, the button literally has a plus one.
But you can see all this stuff in the screen.
Every time you add a friend, it's incrementing your social
Yeah,
capital.
let me see what I do. 'Cause it just shows me. Yeah. I mean,
Should I keep going, or you guys?
no, we're good. Thank you, though.
So, and when I'm showing how many likes my status got, how does that start to guide what I write in that box in the first place? If I'm predisposed to want more likes, and I learn over time what kinds of statuses get more likes, so I'm going to write things that get more likes and write less things that get less likes. And so this desire for more begins to change what we write and post in this system. When I'm told that this ad from happycouple.com got 17,772 likes, how does that change the likelihood that I might like it? I also think of timestamps as a metric. These are the hyper-specific enumerations of age that accompany most content in the system. I mean, I don't really need to know that my friend's me post went live 13 seconds ago versus 19 seconds ago, or that my friend ate a banana 13 minutes ago rather than 14 minutes ago. These distinctions aren't important to me. But they do present the newsfeed as a running conversation that if we step away for just a moment, we're going to miss something important. How does that keep us focused and engaged on the system? And so these numbers play into the growth fetish of capitalism, fueling competition between users to get more likes than someone else. The numbers can make us anxious as we wait for more likes, as we look for quantitative evidence of acknowledgement from others, and as everything gets old right before our eyes. And numbers also compel Facebook's users to reimagine both self and friendship within quantitative terms. And these numbers are visible not just to us, but to our entire network of friends. And these metrics of social performance are playing into how we think about personal worth. And I would argue that having all this visibility situates these users within what I would refer to as a graph opticon, or a combination of the panopticon and the social graph, that creates a form of self-induced audit within social networks, where the many watch the many, or the many watch the metrics of the many, and thus internalize the need to excel in quantitative terms. And so through these metrics, Facebook becomes a technology of control that pushes for continuous consumption within its system of metrics, and that guides our behaviors in ways that maintain or increase our need for that consumption. And so it gives you a sense of a little bit how I'm thinking about what metrics are doing in Facebook. And as an artist, I read and I write, but I also make artworks. And usually I make artworks that try to reveal in some way how a software system changes who we are and what we do. And so towards that end, I created this work that I call the Facebook Metricator. It's a free and open source browser extension that just removes all the numbers. They all go away. Like counts, friend counts, notification numbers, all these things disappear. And there's a prominent toggle right there at the navigation bar, allows you to turn it on or off. And you can see what the effect is and where these numbers exist. And so on the top here, you can see a typical like, share, comment box as it exists in Facebook. On the bottom is what it looks like when you run it with the Metricator. 56 people becomes people like this. 13 shares just becomes shares. View 3 more comments becomes view more comments. No longer is the focus on how much people like my status or how many comments were left, but I have to go look and see who these people are and what they said if I want to learn something about it. No longer is quantity the foregrounded element on the friends page. I can see on the left is with Facebook, on the right is with the Metricator. I can see that I have friends. I could go count them up if I really cared that I had 562 and I wanted to get that number. But that's not the foregrounded element anymore. Even that +1 on the add friend button is removed. Same with that. Now I just know that it's people like this. And that could be one person, it could be 17,000 people. I don't know the difference. And So now I can start to decide for myself if I like this ad or not. With the metricator, I also manipulate the timestamps. So if it's a timestamp like this, something like 6 seconds ago, I just turn that into recently. And if it's a timestamp that's a little bit older, say April 18th, it becomes a while ago. So these are the two, what's that?
3 minutes.
I've only, okay.
Yeah, you give them as much time as you want.
Okay, I've only been talking 9 minutes.
Yeah. 5.
Okay. And so those are the 2 timestamps that you get, just recently or a while ago. And so with this project, I aim to ease what I would call the prescribed sociality these metrics are producing. It does this by taking all of those metrics out of the equation just right from the start. And so the software's been out there since late 2012. I've been updating it as Facebook changes. I've had thousands of people using it, and I get feedback as a result. Now, I should start by pointing out that not everybody sees a reason to have the metricator. So an article about the project on The Verge, somebody wrote, but that's the whole reason for Facebook, to ring up the experience points. They don't really get it. Somebody on Gizmodo said it's useful to strive to maximize numerical success. It's how SATs and many careers work. And finally, a prominent blogger who I won't name wrote me to say, yeah, but those of us with good metrics want to show them. So not everybody is interested in hiding the metrics, but a number of people write me who use the metricator, and I think what they find is really useful for understanding how these metrics are changing their behavior. So one thing it does is it removes addictive behaviors. This person wrote, the notifications become like meth. That all changed when I downloaded the app. This person likens it to a different drug. My flocking to Facebook's little red notification number is akin to a mouse pressing a lever for heroin. Lots of affirmation.
Love heroin.
It can relieve feelings of competition. Person wrote me and said, Facebook's so much more enjoyable without constant pressure to compare when numbers are involved. You can also make people just feel calmer. This person on the minimalism subreddit said, helps you to stop worrying about how many like your posts. By far the most interesting category of feedback that I get reveals that users create rules for themselves around these numbers, and that those rules change how they act and interact with the system. So for example, in the category of likes, people find that without being able to see how many likes something has, they don't know if they can like it. Because it turns out they don't want to like something if it, say, only has 1 or 2 likes. They don't want to be one of those early likers. What if it doesn't become popular? What if they went out on a limb? But on the other extreme, there are people who don't want to like something if it has too many likes. Usually people tell me 20 to 25. You know, if that person's got 25 likes, they don't deserve any more from me. So I don't want to give them my like. And so without the numbers, without being able to see the numbers, they don't know what to do. The same thing happens with timestamps, interestingly. Turns out that people don't want to like things if they're older than about 2 days. They feel like it's out of date. They're going to look out of date if they're talking about things that are old. And so without being able to see the timestamps, they just don't know what to do. In fact, it's the most requested change I get, getting rid of the meditation of timestamps. And so in all cases, I'd say the metricator is relieving these patterns of interaction, the ways that metrics are changing their behavior, but at the same time, it's also serving to reveal the existence of these behaviors in the first place. And because of these types of results and others,
Presenter mics.
I think of
Can we
Facebook
bump that
Metricator
on the room?
as an art project, but also as a piece of critical software. It reveals how Facebook constructs its users, and hopefully eases some of these prescribed patterns of sociality that the metrics produce.
Change this, that's fine. Change to.
So this project I started by taking the Wikipedia entry for emotion and writing down every single emotion that was listed in that entry during August 2012. So there were 70 different emotions. And so I wrote each one of them down, and this is the list of all of the emotions that were listed at that time. And I took each individual emotion and ran that through a Google image search, saving the first 25 images for each emotion. So 25 discrete, images came up under that. And then I took each one of those individual images and brought them into Photoshop. I took an RGB average of each image, which resulted in a solid color for each one of the individual images. And then I took those 25 images and made a 5x5 grid for each emotion. So the grids that you'll be seeing are all for one specific emotion. And the reason for doing this was I was interested in seeing how colors are transmitted and in relation to different emotions, and to see, most importantly, how they were represented popularly through an algorithmic aggregate search function such as Google Images. So the grids are basically showing, the kind of different colors that exist, and it came with certain very interesting results, such as, for example, the grid for affection is mostly browns, because most of the images for affection were actually lions embracing each other in affectionate poses. So, when averaged out in Photoshop, there was a lot of brown. So affection this way is represented clearly by lions in Google Images. So then another thing I want to just note right off the start is that the part of the reason I wanted to do this project also was to think about how emotions are always in relation to each other and how they're constantly changing, and there's something that really flows in very different ways. So along that vein, the Wikipedia entry for emotion actually changes quite frequently. Some emotions are added and others are deleted. So I took a look back before the presentation and noticed which ones had been added or removed. So since August 2012, the entry as of a couple days ago had added confidence, courage, outrage, relief, and self-confidence, and had removed boldness and fearlessness. So I won't have grids for those, but I do have grids for emotions that are no longer listed there. So I thought that was also noteworthy for the project. So, and this is now, as of a couple days ago, the current iteration in the entry. So I was really interested also in approaching something like this in terms of remixing things and seeing the different ways that things can be expressed, whether they be emotions or colors or images, and how they're all, kind of existing together in a continuous flow. So another part of this project that I continued to develop was by taking each one of the individual grids and then running it through a program that actually generates a sound from each image. So you can start to hear how, an algorithm and a specific program, the one I used was called Photosounder, actually interprets the data that are pulled, like initially through the image, through Google servers, through, my specific algorithmic data profile on Google, and then ends up at a certain sound. So I'm just going to play the sounds as I go. So that's and again, the sound goes, it goes left to right, so it's moving across the image as it's generating this sound. So you can kind of think about trying to hear the colors or whatever, experience you might have with these colors. So it's going left to right in that respect. So affection, that's how the program interpreted affection. This is the grid for anger. As you might expect, it has lots of pinks and reds. We're calling the association of red with anger. And another thing that I did was to write down all of the suggested related searches that Google proposed when putting the original emotion into the image search. It will suggest other things you might be interested in searching for. And so I found these also just noteworthy and relevant, just the way that it's aggregating data in this specific way, and it's suggesting other things you might be interested in if you're searching for this specific emotion. And this is the sound for anger. And they do kind of all sound a little similar at first, but I'll play them more, you know, quickly at the end, and you'll hopefully start to be able to hear the differences between them. So this is the grid for arousal, and the reason why it's mostly blank white spaces was because most of the images for arousal were actually graphs of arousal in terms of the idea of stress, like, and so it graphed, you know, graphs like showing a body under stress, and so it was mostly just black and white graphs, and so when that was averaged out in Photoshop, it just came out to white, you know, white spaces. So I'm interested in, you know, in just noticing things like this and how, you know, somebody searching for an image, searching within Google Images for something like arousal might not expect to find just some black and white graphs. So and this is what that one sounds like. This is the one for boldness. I thought it was really interesting that they all came out very blue. And I was especially interested in the terms for this one, like boldness symbol and holy boldness, being bold, truculent, vehemently. Like they're very like active, kind of almost aggressive terms. And so I thought it was interesting that a lot of them came out blue as well. The one for Curiosity was largely images of the Mars rover that had landed that was named Curiosity. So you can see that the colors from this one are mostly colors we associate with Mars, like, you know, like deep reds and browns and things like that. So again, just thinking about how, you know, something like there being a rover on Mars, you know, returns Curiosity as the first 25 images under this search. See what I'm doing on time. Okay. The grid for Desire returned a certain model of a cell phone, HTC's Desire. So I was actually really surprised. I was looking forward to see what the Desire one actually showed, and it mostly was just the same stock image over and over again of a cell phone. So that one was kind of boring, actually. So this is the grid for Euphoria, and this one was also particularly noteworthy because it returned images for Calvin Klein's Euphoria, which is a kind of perfume. And so again, it was mostly like the same stock image of a perfume bottle. And so you can see that represented in the different shades of purple that are there. And then next I started to think about putting the different emotions in conversation with each other, like contrasting something like fear with fearlessness, and thinking about, you know, looking at the grid for fear, and it feels very heavy. There's a lot of like dark, muddy colors, where fearlessness, you know, is a lot lighter, and there are, you know, colors like bright pink and green that kind of show up there. So just thinking about like, you know, those two emotions in conversation with each other, and how I as a viewer of this work feel when I look at those grids, and how you all as viewers of the work would feel looking at those grids as well, and just thinking about like, you know, on a very affective, embodied level, how we feel our emotions, and how when we look at colors that changes the way that we feel emotions, or when we hear sounds, like how that's very much tied into emotion as well. So this is what fear sounds like. And then fearlessness is... So you can start to kind of see like the difference between those two. Horror was, as you might expect, a lot of just very intense images. A lot of them were from video games, so that came out very, very dark. And then the next two images that I wanted to talk about are joy and sadness. And I wanted to put those two in conversation, thinking about the 17th century philosopher Spinoza's concepts of joy and sadness. And he approached joy and sadness as the two basic emotions that either increase or decrease the body's capacity or power for action or for affect. And he saw joy as something that increases the body's capacity to relate to others and to enter into composition with them. And he saw sadness as something that kind of decreased it and decomposed relations. So I was interested in putting those two in conversation together. And again, just looking at, you know, sadness feels, you know, it feels heavy and it feels a little depressing. And the images, you know, the grid for this one here feels kind of, you know, like just muddier colors and grays and purples, where Joy has, you know, just different colors that are more, I mean, I feel joy when looking at this grid, and I feel a little sad when looking at the sadness grid. So, okay. And then the final one is looking at surprise and wonder together. So wonder, I'm particularly interested in the emotion of wonder, and I wanted to read a quote from Luce Rigore, where she talks about wonder in the world. And she says, "Attracting me toward, wonder keeps me from taking and assimilating directly to myself. Wonder is a mourning for the self as an autarkic entity, whether this mourning is triumphant or melancholy. Wonder must be the advent or the event of the other, the beginning of a new story." So in this respect, I was interested in wonder here in terms of, you know, opening up something for conversation. And again, like thinking about the relationality of emotions and how we relate to others. And I think I just love her conception of wonder in this aspect and in that quote. So I'll just quickly play these together so you can kind of hear them. Desire, horror, joy, surprise. And that is it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next presenter is Meagan Winkelman. She sort of notes for camp for the digital age. About fellow artists and psychoanalysts looking important to me to analyze things that are waste of time. She's a student artist at the University of Oregon, and she has a special interest in Tumblr culture.
All right, so today we're going to be looking at reading a version of camp on Tumblr, which I'm calling Digital Camp. So I'm arguing to read an aesthetic sensibility in the microblogging platform Tumblr. I don't know why I added that prefix, as if you don't know, as a version of camp which is unique to contemporary digital culture. So my goal in doing this is to look at the critical ironies it reveals in dominant narratives of progress. So I'm looking at the ways that digital artists are appropriating aesthetically and technologically passé objects to make still and moving images which are irrespective to logics of good design, which structure the majority of the web. So before I go further, okay. Right, so we're betraying good design on the web. And so I'm going to familiarize us with the sensibility just briefly via Tumblr search hashtags like cpunk, netart, allowave, vaporwave, plantwave, some more waves mentioned over here. Rather than trying to distinguish between these different waves or speak to these specific aesthetic sensibilities, my approach is instead to talk about a general sensibility I'm saying is informing the content within all of them, which is deployed in response to and sometimes in resistance to dominant cultural assumptions about taste in relation to technology. So first we're going to talk a little bit about defining the camp sensibility. So a sensibility is a way of seeing things that's seldom directly talked about by those who have it. In Notes on Camp, Susan Sontag's famous essay from 1964, she warns that a sensibility is almost ineffable, so we basically can't define it, but we're going to try to anyway. She warns that it's ineffable, and likewise, we have Fabio Clito, who wrote the introduction to the book on camp, which you can actually see in Ryan Johnson and I's art installation in Studio D, that there's no straight path to trying to define camp. Like I said, we're still trying. So this is how I'm going to try. There's an affinity for the past, which is expressed through anachronistic appropriations and juxtapositions, including appreciation of objects which lack or have declined in cultural and economic value, with the passing of time specifically. And then finally, there's a privileging of what's considered fake or artificial over what's considered real or genuine. So these distinctions, I'm arguing, are further complicated by the conditions of creating, publishing, and experiencing art on the internet. So first off, anachronism, usually used to define a person or thing that's chronologically out of place. So neoclassical statuary with computer interface graphics like file folders, we could look at that as anachronism. However, basically anachronism assumes that there is a correct order of things in time, and that something must be incorrect about the order of things in time. So in examining digital camp, we're going to look at what those assumptions are. So in art on the internet, for example, which of these is violating the chronology of time that is correct, especially as we're viewing art in a digital interface, so on the computer, on Tumblr, on our mobile phones, etc. So basically, although I'm using Sontag's statements from Notes on Camp a lot, her statements have also been criticized for proposing that camp is apolitical. My stance is that digital camp is not, as Sontag might suppose, playing with classical art imagery and references to computing simply for sensibility's sake. I'm also not entertaining notions which suppose the sensibility is simply a trend reproduced for the sake of reproduction on Tumblr, or a meme. I'm not taking that approach at all. Instead, I'm looking at how temporal incongruities signal a celebration of these objects which have lost value, and follow a logic contrary to those proposed by progression of technology under consumer capitalism. So basically, there's this idea of camp as history's waste, right? So in reading camp in films like, for example, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, Andrew Ross writes that the camp affect is created not simply by a change in the mode of cultural production, but rather when the products, in this case Hollywood stars, of a much earlier mode of production, which has lost its power to produce and dominate cultural meanings, has been made available in the present for redefinition according to contemporary codes of taste. So these codes of taste that Ross refers to are the result not only of the development of new products, which make us forget older products, in this case Hollywood stars, but also changing modes of production. So Baby Jane Hudson is passé in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, not simply because she has aged, but because she's the product of a mode of cultural production, in this case vaudeville theater, which no longer dominates or determines value. So we're talking about the intersection of cultural production and also technological production in terms of defining what is good taste. So basically, we know that the discourse around development of consumer technologies is predicated on a narrative of progress as a moral and intellectual imperative. We've heard a lot about this at the conference so far. I'm not sure which thing to reference. In this context, the design of computing technologies is imbued with moral significance. For example, the democratization of knowledge is generally thought of as an ongoing measure of computing technologies' progress. A similar narrative exists for the democratization of the means of production of media. In many ways, assumptions about the relationship between the development of consumer technologies and moral and intellectual progress justifies a normative assumption that outdated technology should be forgotten and regarded as waste, right? However, meanwhile, at the same time, developments in consumer technology consider to generate e-waste. So definitely hearing Andrea's talk yesterday about techno-trash struck a chord with this, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So digital camp is celebrating e-waste as such. So the camp affinity for the waste of technological progress is pretty hard to consider apolitical, as Sontag suggests about camp. However, the sentiment is completely different from what we could imagine from straight activism on the subject. For example, educating people about techno-trash. 5, yeah, okay. So in dominant narratives of technological progress, The materiality of the progress is what's usually excluded. So this is new, because instead of the aging of objects being part of why they are now out of date, we actually have the material objects being ignored in the consideration of what is out of date, and the eventual deterioration of material objects or lack thereof is what is part of what's distinctly ignored. So I should talk a little bit about, so right, we have a narrative of technology being related to progress, so why would you want bad technology? And that has to do with why it is resistant to many different assumptions that are dominant in our culture to evoke technology which is out of date, not useful, etc. So another thing about camp is the idea that it is about aestheticism. So Sontag says that it's a way of seeing the world as an aesthetic phenomenon, not in terms of beauty, but in terms of the degree of artifice or of stylization. So this opens up another can of worms, basically, for examining digital art. Because camp has always been considered something which is questioning real versus fake boundaries and binaries. But now we have a dominant culture including virtual things. And we have standards for understanding what a good virtual experience might be. So we have another level of highlighting what is virtual and kind of pointing to virtuality itself in a certain expressive way. So just to talk about these binaries a little more, I have a table, right? So I just made this really quick to talk about some of the binaries that we can be talking about. So we have camp versus sincere performance, unnatural and natural, online versus in real life, simulated versus experience, aesthetic versus meaning. So there's an idea that we're working with the virtual, but we're playing up the virtual in a way to demonstrate always already virtualness, basically, in aesthetics online. So similarly, okay, so for further consideration, I wanted to add this after hearing Andrew's talk yesterday. So she suggested, basically, in relation to techno-trash, so huge amounts of technological waste and the varying forces of exploitation and ecological problems resulting from that. She suggested that perhaps people have to develop coping mechanisms for dealing with the fact that they continue to use technology despite the fact that there are huge, huge problems. Okay. So I wanted to suggest maybe talking about digital camp as one of these coping mechanisms or as something in relation to that experience, which might involve feelings of hopelessness, or this is just basically a lot of things, feelings of hopelessness or feelings of a lack of ability to resolve these problems, meanwhile endless ability to create expressive works meditating on the same problems. So pretty much out of time. I didn't put a slide about this, but if you'd like to check out Ryan Johnson and I's art installation in Studio D, we're also looking at this camp aesthetic in a little bit, in a certain fashion. So, cool. Thank you.
Okay, so just a word about this is that this is an unmoderated, unfiltered stream from Vine. So if you see anything that you'd rather not see, I apologize in advance because you're going to probably see something. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit about this project. It's called 24 Hour Social. It basically has 24 hours of Vine videos. There's one Vine video for every second of the day. That's 86,400 in total. And it's very much a work in progress. So I'm approaching this as a work in progress. I'm kind of going to think aloud about what I'm going to do with this. This is kind of the first iteration of it, but there's more to come. So what it is essentially, it's a 24-hour long, it's a generative video installation. The vines are shown at the time they were posted to social media. So they've all been time-stamped. So when you see a vine there, it has been posted exactly at this time within a 6-second frame. And if you don't know vines, vines are kind of like video tweets. They're 6-second long kind of status updates. So in one way, this is a durational video work. It kind of follows in this tradition of Warhol's Empire, Douglas Gordon's 24-Hour Psycho, Christian Marclay's The Clock. So this is the videos that go for a very long time. It's a little different, certainly to Warhol, and there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of action, there's a lot of activity, whereas Warhol would have been much more about things, not a lot of things happening, more kind of an authentic experience. It's also recalling Warhol had this idea of everyone would have 15 minutes of frame. With Vine, we've got it down to 6 seconds, so we're getting better at that. There's also, I think, in this idea, because it's 24 hours, because there's a video for every second of the day, it kind of plays around with ideas of authenticity, or in some way, because it's so complete, that it reflects, somehow it reflects everyday life, or at least network public representations of everyday life, or performances of people's lives, which may or may not be authentic. I probably, we'll talk about that. I think what it does is it gives a sense of the complexity, and it takes and the always-on relentlessness of Vine video. This is it's just keeps going. It keeps going. There's more and more of it wherever they came from. There's a lot more. But it's also quite upbeat. I mean, one thing about Vine is I noticed when looking at it is that it's very positive. It's lots of fun going on. There's not a lot of negativity, which was kind of surprising. But it's also transforming this material. So we're taking this very ephemeral, very pithy form, and we're extending it. We're making it epic. We're making it, making it on a grand scale over a long period of time. It's also projected. So this is designed for kind of intimate mobile iPads, phones, things like that. So even by transforming it into a projection, it has this whole different feel. So it's kind of transforming the material. So I guess the question is this a kind of a portrait of the social web? I say yes and no. It is and it isn't, because as a portrait we're missing some of the picture, because with this what I've done is I've taken away the context. We don't see the tweets that accompanied these, so we don't know what the hashtag was. We don't know what the text was that went with it. We don't know what people were saying about it in Vine. Was it part of some kind of meme? Was it part of some kind of conversation? So we're just getting the videos, and we don't really have any sense of what's going on behind all this. Just want to talk a little bit about what kind of the ideas behind it. When I came across Vine, I was pretty interested in, when I heard the idea of Vine, 6-second videos. What can you say in 6 seconds? I mean, it seems preposterous. But at the same time, it's a very defined thing. It's like when I first heard about Twitter, 140 characters, what can you say on that? But people have worked with it, and people have pretty much made something of Twitter. And I think the same is happening in Vine. There's also the affordances of the Vine app. So Vine is always made through the Vine app. And the Vine app has this kind of stop motion, stop-start button. So you record by holding your finger down, and when you take it up, it stops. So you got this kind of stop motion thing, which we kind of see through a lot of Vine videos. I was also interested in what was the difference between Vine and YouTube. What kind of videos would we get that were kind of particular to Vine, as opposed to what we get in YouTube? We're familiar enough with YouTube. We know what kind of stuff we get there. I think in one way it's also a truly mobile phenomenon. This isn't kind of a desktop computer. This is app-based. It's on your phone, it's on your tablet. It doesn't really work anywhere else. And it's also, because of the length of the videos, it has this idea of being ephemeral. There's an ephemerality associated with it. And we'll talk about that because I don't think it's necessarily true. But there is a sense that, because it's so short, well, it's going to be ephemeral. It's not going to stick around too long, is it? We can just put it up there and not need to worry about it. Which is part of this work, because this work has downloaded it all. So even though it's ephemeral, we know that nothing goes away on the internet. It's always there. I was also looking at it as data, because Vine is very much, it's all about the data. It was always, when Vine started, it was much more hard-nosed than, say, when Twitter started. So when Twitter started, let's all share this data and everyone can have access to the fire hose. And then subsequently that all changed and they've subsequently started to lock down the data more and more, to the point where people actually sued them to get access to the fire hose because they said there was a verbal contract given to them in the early days. And they're actually successful in that. There's no API for Vine. They make great efforts to kind of lock this down to stop you getting at it. They can't stop you, but they do make a good bit of effort. It's quite difficult to get at the data here. So this is very much user-generated content, and it's building the value of the Vine company. But they're locking it down as best they can, and they're very straight about it. There's still no API. They've shut down the unofficial API quite recently, and there's this war of attrition with people trying to get access to this content. So how did I do it? So basically what I did was I scraped Twitter. I did it with Scraper Wiki in the early days of Scraper Wiki, which is a great service to scrape at data. Again, that's becoming more difficult to work with, but it can be done in different ways. So I got a database of about 6 million tweets. And from this, I analyzed it for time, because I was interested in the temporal qualities to this. So what I did was I basically got them, sorted them by time, so I could have one video for every second of the day that was actually posted to Twitter at that time. I ran a script then to find the video URL, which was masked in different ways. They were all hosted on Amazon Web Services. I downloaded them. They were renamed then to the time, and they were put into a vast database. So I've got about 100,000 Vine videos on this little external drive here. So that's like, pretty large thing. And then it's running processing, and processing pulls the database. It says what time is it, and then shows videos that were made in that 6-second window. So what are the findings, or what am I looking at with this kind of project? This is very much a research project. I'm very much trying to figure out, well, what can we do with this data? Why is this data interesting? So if you think of Twitter as, and I've got a quotes easy, Papatrizi for this. Twitter is a social awareness platform that affords networked and condensed performances of the self. And I think this could be applied also to Vine, maybe with some modifications. It's very much about, I think, data performativity, or performativity through data. And we can say that, also talking about Twitter, that presentations of the self performed in data persist. They're difficult to erase completely. They're easily replicated. They're available to large audiences of known and unknown, audiences which are known and unknown, and publics as well. And they're easily searchable. And again, that's Papatrizi. So what did I find, if I'm going to categorize what I found in this? First of all, I think I was struck by the creativity. There was a lot of elaborate setups. There was a lot of effort went into a 6-second payoff in the video. There was a lot of, these were not just tossed off. Most of them were, there was a lot of work, there was a lot of rehearsal went into it. In that way, it kind of reminded me of the late 90s web. The idea of the web as a space of creativity where you went out there and you did interesting things just for the sake of doing it, just because you could. I kind of looked at it, I was wondering if you could see kind of global trends was going to be very much Anglo-centric. I'm still looking at it, I haven't, it needs more analysis to see that. And if I was to categorize the types of Vines I saw, I think performance is very much the kind of the key thing here. They've all been rehearsed, they've been practiced, there's a lot of setups going into it. Twerking obviously is the key performance event, we will say, and there's a lot of twerking in this, and there's a lot of different types of twerking, a lot of elaborate twerking, and practicing of twerking and stuff. There's also traditional kind of notions of performance. We got singing, we got dancing, we got comedy, less so than YouTube, but it's there and it's in kind of a shorter format. So it's slightly different to YouTube, but you can see it's resembled. There's obviously a lot of selfies. There's a lot of video selfies. You can see them. They're all over it. There's people just talking to the camera, doing that thing. There's also a lot of sexual performance. There's a lot of people showing you what they've got in different ways, professional and non-professional, probably mostly non-professional, I would say. There's also a lot of stuff taken off television, taken off screens, recorded off the internet, recorded off television, and just retweeted or revine back up. There's records of events, so there's things that are happening, just like a 6-second synopsis of some event that you went to, cut down to 6 seconds because, who can wait that long? There's also, interestingly, they're not all 6 seconds. There's quite a lot of them don't bother with the full 6 seconds because if you can say it in 3 seconds or 4 seconds, go for it. There's a lot of elaborate setups. So we see costumes, wigs, group coordinated actions. One of my favorite was a military unit, looked like somewhere like Afghanistan, maybe 25 guys all twerking in formation while holding on to some kind of large military equipment. So it's good to know what your tax dollars are doing out there, There's a lot of stop motion, but not stop motion animation. So there's a lot of flying, things disappearing, reappearing as if by magic. It's a lot of inventive stuff, but no stop motion animation. I haven't yet to see that, which is really interesting, kind of traditional type. And then there's memes. There's things like Slapcam, which I don't know if any of you have seen Slapcam. It involves you get a bottle of water, some kind of shaving foam, and you come up, throw water on someone and slap them really hard till you knock them over. And there's a lot of that. It's just really mean. That's the kind of the mean thing in Vine. There's car twerking, which is this thing where people twerk upside down in the passenger seat of a car while driving. They're not obviously driving. And then there's the bossy girlfriend meme, where there's a guy being all macho, and then his girlfriend comes in the last second of the scene and basically tells him what to do. And that's a kind of a big meme. But what's the value of the data set? Okay. And that's one of the interesting things. That's what I wanted to kind of bring up here is I have a large data set. I have a lot of vines. It's obviously useful for some kind of analysis, and I'm still thinking about this because this is very much driven toward the art piece. So it's a large timestamp collection of Vine, and I'm interested to know how can we augment our knowledge of Vine and the social performativity that it represents. But also what's to say about Vine and other social platforms and their efforts to lock down the data, especially when there's an expectation, and I think there is an expectation, something like Vine, that these kind of ephemeral videos that they're going away, that they're not going to be mined forever. And of course, you might say that's unrealistic, and it is, but at the same time, it's there, I think, when you have this kind of ephemerality. And yeah, so I'll pretty much leave it at that. And I'm interested in maybe talking to people if you are interested in looking at this data set. I've got almost 100,000 videos. It's quite a large data set, but I think it has interesting things to look at. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
I guess for when I think about body metrics, there is still a concept of more going on. It's in more consumption. It's in trying to deal with wanting to be more fit, wanting to have more reps, wanting to have more miles run, wanting to have more ways and all these different manipulations of the body. And it certainly doesn't translate to calories. I don't want more calories. But I think the concept in general is still in operation. It's just that
more data points.
Yeah, in this case, it's because there's just it's not a value-based kind of thing. I mean, the value, I guess, in a sense of more in calories or more in weight is really less. Maybe that's the way to think about it.
I wanted to add to that there's actually a program for your computer which will take your clock. It's called Fuzzy Clock, and it will take your clock and it will take away the kind of strict blocks of time. It'll say a little after 6 or 4:30 or nearly 12. And I was reminded of that during your presentation, and I think it's a really cool app. Actually, I really like it. But just thinking about more of the feeling of things, people like this, or it's close to 6, rather than the strict this is exactly more or less, or in terms of thinking about quantification and qualification and stuff like that.
Sure.
So I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the quantified self movement?
Yeah, certainly.
This idea where it's it's got much bigger, where it's quantifying everything about your your physical. Well, I guess it's your whole life, but more is your body, isn't it? More particularly.
Mm-hmm.
I also wanted to add, if I can, that I'm going to be extending this project, and I'll be tweeting about this, but Basically, I'm gonna create a SurveyMonkey survey where anybody can take it, and the results will be anonymous, but what I'm thinking for the design would be to write down all the 70 emotions, and that anybody that wants to take the survey can just pick off the 5 emotions that they, however they want to choose them, whether they feel them like the most. Like I was thinking, you know, about your talk, Ben, like in terms of like the problematic of saying like most, you know, something like that. So I was thinking, okay, not necessarily the ones they feel the most often or stuff like that, but just, you know, the 5 emotions that they, you know, would pick out of the 70 ones, and then extending that and crowdsourcing that through Twitter and through the hashtag. So if people want to just watch in the future, I'm going to add that to the project as another way to just remix and think about emotions in relation to each other. So just wanted to let everybody know about that too.
I was very interested that you were finding certain words like desire, euphoria, were basically taken by marketing.
Yeah.
Destroyed,
Yeah, that's a really good point.
So the whole, every reference you were coming up with was basically an ad for something.
Yeah, and that was one of the reasons I was interested in it, is to see like how, you know, how they're being represented, you know, through like such a giant aggregator such as Google. So.
And they changed, right? Didn't the definition on one of the Wikipedia pages become like more positive the next year?
The definition for a specific emotion, or
there was a specific word, yeah, for a specific emotion, and it was more marketable.
Yeah,
let's say.
Yeah, that's interesting. More marketable, like desire, like and happiness, and like a very specific form of affect becoming more marketable. So.
Do we have a general question I have, and because I believe we're the first panel devoted to art, at least that word being there, is why are these art pieces, or are they art pieces? Or, and maybe in your case, if this is not an art piece per se, why do a lot of the Tumblr pages become considered art? It's an annoying question. I know people don't like aesthetics, but it's I think relevant here.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're definitely talking about different types of artistic production. So I'm talking about the main distinction to make on Tumblr is that this is like not compensated or institutionally validated in most regards. However, it does like follow the same thing that anybody using social media or using blogging to have an audience might be doing, which could be building cultural capital or like building a notion of themselves, which is then in turn marketable. It's not unheard of to hear about people who are making net art on Tumblr who are also kind of graphic designers who are like also, this is tied up with their professional artist career identity. But also I think that affectually there's like a notion of illegitimacy or pointlessness or hopelessness, which is also prevalent in the things that are being made.
Yeah. That's an interesting point because it makes me think of a lot of those Gifs that kind of spin and rotate. And like one of my students has one that just, it's a GIF of the word depressed, just rotating.
Yeah, definitely.
And that, I think that's what you're talking about.
Absolutely. Just that's one that I made. Yeah.
I mean, in terms of, did you say something? I was going to say, in terms of like thinking about like what is art and what is not art, like it's a question that I constantly, struggle to define, if it can even be defined at all. And the way that I've started to approach it in my own work and in looking at others' work is after Deleuze, and just thinking about art as an event and as a relation between the artist, materials, the artwork itself, and the viewer, and how they all kind of enter into an assemblage with each other, and how that's constantly shifting. In the same way that the whole world is constantly shifting. So that's the best kind of operational definition that I can come up with so far for what art is, not necessarily what it is, but what it does, and to think about it like as an event, and as just a relation between many different entities and forms. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, I think there was also a question you posed in your presentation which could point us to a sort of common theme when you asked, why would we want bad technology, if technology is considered a progress. But, in a way we can say that art is important because it's not progressive as such. It does not work as such. It doesn't have a specific aim. This is one definition, of course, but this pointlessness and this aimlessness that it's perhaps a facilitating play rather than direct productivity is something encountered, I think, in all the projects, especially yours, where there's it's by virtue of removing that injunction towards production, it aims towards contemplation more.
From my perspective, a strong artwork takes something we experience perhaps in everyday life, and it makes us look at it differently in some way. And in the case of Demetricator, it takes something we're experiencing all day, in some cases all night, and it takes a fundamental aspect of it and it just tweaks it a little bit to give us a different idea of what that experience could be. And some people don't even think of it as art. Some people just like that it makes the interface cleaner, and that's fine. Some people do think of it as art, and that's fine too. I think of it as art. I think art is something that's created by an artist. It's a composed thing that changes or presents or thinks about what a problem might be.
I think as well, picking up on Benjamin's point, it's important, I think a lot of what the work these projects do is to kind of question the way we interpret these technologies, the way we use them, and kind of the logic that is kind of embedded in them. So I think by pointing out different aspects of them, by questioning different aspects of them, it causes kind of a rethinking. We can rethink it, we can look at it and say, well, does it necessarily have to be this way? Is this inherent in this technology that we're using, or could it be better? Could it be more centered toward the user, and could it be more of a space for creation rather than just always being this kind of this marketing onslaught that we're kind of faced with? And I think that's one of the important things that art projects do, and particularly artwork projects that work with technology, is they kind of expand the range of uses. They expand the kind of the acceptable things that you can do with a technology, the acceptable kind of way that we can interpret them and work with it. And that way, it's doing I think these kind of projects do really important work, because rather than just always taking Facebook, you can't kill it. It's there. It's going to be there for quite a while. So do we have to take Facebook as what Mark Zuckerberg would like Facebook to be, or is there a way of actually turning that itself? And I think artists have an important part to play in this, to kind of turn it around and expand it and broaden it out and make it available for different uses and for different constituencies.
Don't take questions from the room.
Are there any questions?
Hi, sorry, this question is for Meagan. Bigelow, actually, sorry, your presentation was great too, I promise. I was interested in, how our own expectations might affect our interpretation of your project. So, just to give an example, because that's super vague. I'm not sure if I read it this way, but one way you might read, for example, going through some of the results and saying, now this one is actually white because there were a bunch of graphs in there, is you could kind of read it as qualifying or hedging that it might not be a true or real result. And I'm not sure I would read it that way, but that opens up a bunch of problems in how you read whether you're getting emotions out of the results, right? So I was wondering if you just had anything you could riff off of that with, or thoughts about that.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, especially in terms of truth. I don't really believe in truth as a general thing. I'm pretty much a relations and a process, and a meeting is constantly changing person. So that was one thing that I was actually interested in this project, is in how much things do change and how often the Wikipedia entry changes. And I'm sure if I were to repeat repeat this experiment today, I mean, the grids would look, very, very different. Not only because the entry has changed, but also because the images themselves are constantly shifting. So I actually, now you've got me curious to kind of repeat something like the arousal search to see like if it's still mostly just graphs, and black and white, just kind of, graphs like that, or if it's changed a little bit. So yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you.
It makes me want to take prevalent pictures of those emotions and post them all over to see if Google actually picked them up.
And like read back into it.
I want to influence it.
It's always changing, so.
Hi, I think this is for Conor, and it was specifically interesting for me listening to your talk and watching your images as your data on the screen behind you, as you're sort of explaining to me your process and what you're thinking about, and it just keeps me thinking even about this sort of academic setting, about how we provide our results, how we tell the story about what we're researching. It was fascinating to just sort of be looking at your raw data as you're telling me this story, which was an experience, I would say, in the sort of performance in itself. Do you do this in different ways? Is this intentional? I like it.
Well, this is a particular project, so I figured rather than show slides, I think it's more, I'm going to show you more about the project by actually showing it to you live. And it's also, I'm trying to, I think for this project, I'm still trying to work through it, because in one way I'm kind of, I'm critiquing Vine, I'm critiquing the way they kind of use this user-generated content, but I'm also doing the same thing. I'm just replicating our model on a much smaller scale for my art project and for my talk and things. So I'm kind of, I'm stuck in that position there. But yeah, I think this is something I'm thinking through. So normally I would do a fairly standard slide talk, but this seems to make more sense for this one. And I think you get more from it just by looking at what's there. And of course I don't know what's coming up. I've never watched all these, there's just too many of them, and you play at a different time of the day, you get a different set of videos, and then for every video there's multiple choices. So just the algorithm will randomly pick one video for that second, but it could be a different one every time, so it's never quite the same.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah.
I had a question, I guess, pertaining to your project as well, with Vine specifically, and not showing the loop, like the idea of looping, because it's not really 6 seconds, it's however many times you watch it, and this is my experience with people Vining performances and all sorts of things, and I think that connects actually in some ways to a lot of what you all are talking about, like a type of framing, a minimal effort that's then repeated, and then that gains a different kind of significance. So what's your thinking about not showing something that seems to be inherently important about that system?
Yeah, I've done a lot of kind of decontextualizing the vines as well. I talked about how it's like, it's on a big screen, it's projected. But also I see the vines as, instead of like individual performances which are repeated, I'm kind of looking at the whole thing as a performance. So if you take, instead of one video, one vine being it, if you take Vine as being this ongoing performance, and that all the different pieces are playing its part in it. So I'm kind of collecting everything together, and the performance is the performance of Vine, rather than the performance of one individual or two individuals that have made particularly special videos. So this idea that the cumulative effort that goes into it has become, in some way, defines Vine, because Vine is only as good as its content. It provides a set of tools, and then it generates its content. So that's what I wanted to look at it in this one, was just this, Vine is the performance, and the performance is made up of, like, in this case, 86,000 whatever videos, but this goes, that's just one day, and then there's the next day, and there's the day after that, and there's what, I think they're saying now that they've got 15 posted a second. That data is quite old, again with Vine. They're very reserved with what data they put out there. So it's very hard to know how many people are vining, how many people have the app, how many videos are posted every day. That data just isn't coming out. They're leaking it somehow to advertisers, but they're certainly not putting that in the public forum.
I just want to add briefly that this point you make, you're watching Vine as long as you're staying there as a viewer, and in the same way you could with a painting. And to tie all this back to art, with the internet, we praise the virtues of it being user-friendly and the users, but what does it mean to be a disinterested viewer of things online? And I think everyone here sort of has augmented things or have shown different ways that we can be viewers and not necessarily users.